In the last video, we spoke about how the presence of corrupt authorities in the novel was one of the ways in which Crónica de la Muerte Anunciada reflected Colombian society of the time. I'd like us to think a bit more in this third video about other ways in which aspects of Colombian society, particularly the society of the 1950s, are present in the novel. I'll talk a little bit about la violencia, ideas about gender, and finally a little about immigration. So what is la violencia? As the name suggests, this was a particularly violent moment in Colombia's history, and one with a long legacy. La violencia was a 10-year-long civil war from 1948 to 1958. It was sparked by the assassination of the Liberal Party presidential candidate Jorge Eliezer Gaitan on the 9th of April 1948, and this immediately led to confrontations between liberals and conservatives, leading to the Bogotazo riots, so riots in the capital Bogotá, in which there were around 5,000 casualties. And this grew out of Bogotá throughout the country, leading to peasant-on-peasant violence, and this is particularly unusual. So even within the same town, the same village, people would turn on each other and fight as part of the civil war. Over these 10 years, there were around 200,000 civilian deaths. And as I said, this still has a long legacy in Colombia up to today. We don't see la violencia at any point in Crónica. It's not even really mentioned, but it was fundamental in García Márquez's life and career. As I said in my first video, García Márquez started his career as a journalist, and that was during his time as a student in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So he was writing precisely when la violencia was happening and was exposed to it, often reporting on it to people around Colombia. So what we see in the novel then is not the political conflict, but the willingness of people within even the same small town to turn against each other, and also the fact that violence is omnipresent. Even though it's these two brothers, Pedro and Pablo Vicario, who ultimately murder Santiago Nazar, as we've said, the entire town seems to be implicated. They also don't seem, on the most part, surprised by the horrific violence that they witness. Therefore, a reader who's familiar with this history, who knew what was happening in Colombia in the 1950s, can imagine that these people are used to this legacy of violence. The novel then urges us to question our own reactions to violence, to the fact that we find the violence against Santiago so abhorrent, and yet people in the novel are quite used to it, and in fact many of the characters are actively willing the Vicario brothers to kill Santiago. This rush to violence, although representative of the period of the violencia, also fits with the topic of social norms, and particularly gender norms. In the 1950s in Colombia, the concept of honra was still present. This is an extremely old concept, going back even to the Middle Ages in Spain, and one that was carried to Latin America through the Spanish conquistadores and colonizers. The idea of honra, in short, is to do with the protecting the virginity of any females in the family. The idea is that it's the parents, but also any brothers' responsibility to make sure that the young daughter, sister, remains a virgin until marriage. If she doesn't, this means that the family has lost its honour, and this honour needs to be avenged. What we see though is that this is quite based on class. Ángela is reasonably middle class. Her family, although not as rich as Santiago's family, and certainly not as rich as her husband Bayardo San Román, have a certain level of social status, and that means it's important for them to keep their honra. When Ángela is returned by Bayardo on her wedding night to her family, she needs an excuse, she needs a reason, and the family need to pay for what happened with blood through revenge. If they didn't, they would lose their status as a family, and indeed the Cortés family tell the brothers, el honor no se espera. So the brothers have no choice but to kill Santiago to reclaim their family honour. However, we see this is not the case for everyone. Indeed, the male characters, including the narrator, boast about going to see a prostitute. They talk about this in quite positive terms. This was an important moment in their life, and not just moment, but something that they do regularly. So we see a double standard here, where men are allowed to be sexually free in a way that women are not, but also that women of a certain social status need to protect their honour in a way that women of a lower social status are seen as dispensable. We see this particularly in the character of Divinia Flor, who works in Santiago Nazar's house, and there is the implication that Santiago has been taking advantage of Divinia Flor in the same way in which his father did her mother. To the point that she states, en el fondo de su alma quería que lo mataran. So we're sensing that behind Santiago's murder there are very complex interrelations between class and gender and power, and who is allowed to do what. It's important to remember that the reason why honra was so prevalent a topic was all to do with money as well, and particularly protecting the money, the inheritance that continues down a family line. Ángela needed to remain a virgin on her wedding night so that they could prove that her child was Bayardo's, so that Bayardo's money going to the child would stay in the family line. Those without money don't have the same issue to worry about. Thinking about gender, another thing is another important aspect of the novel is about the expectations of a bride. Ángela, we're told, is beautiful but dumb, or not very interesting as a conversationalist. She has been raised her whole life to be married. Her and her sisters are trained to be the best possible brides. The best possible brides, though, are not conversationalists. So this tells us again about what was expected of a middle class or upper class wife at the time. She was someone who was supposed to be loyal and beautiful, something to show off, but not necessarily an equal in terms of education or interests or ability to be part of a society. And the fascinating thing about Ángela is that although she goes through this tragedy of being returned to her family, being beaten by her mother and being exiled from her home, this is freeing for her because it means that she can finally be herself. She doesn't need to worry about being the perfect bride. She will never be the perfect bride now. And so she can take time to actually develop a personality. And when the narrator meets her so many years later to work on his story, he finds that she's a completely different person, and that she has much more control over herself and her destiny. She writes hundreds and hundreds of letters to Bayardo, eventually convincing him to return to her, but this time as equals, both damaged, but both able to start a life away from the conventions of society at the time. The final point I wanted to talk about was immigration. It's important that Santiago is of Arab descent. He's representative of the large wave of migrants from the Middle East from around the 1880s to the 1930s. So his father would have been one of these people who came from the Middle East to Colombia looking for work and often went on to be very successful traders, making use of their transnational links. What we see in the novel is that Santiago and his father and their family become very successful, and that this leads to a certain amount of resentment, that the family are seen in some ways as outsiders, although they do maintain a certain level of respect and social class because of their money. So when Santiago is murdered, some of the villagers assume that the Arab community will rise up and turn to violence to take revenge for one of their own. This fits in with ideas at the time, again, about the outsider, about the migrant as being different, but also perhaps more violent than the locals. However, the novel contradicts this by having the Arab community urge peace, and instead it be the local native Colombians who are the ones who turn to graphic violence. In summary, Garcia Marquez weaves these themes of violence, particularly inter-community violence, gender norms, machismo, and ostracization, or treating immigrants as outsiders, to reflect on the Colombia in which he grew up, the Colombia in which he started his career, but also the Colombia in the time in which he was writing, to urge readers to reflect on how much had changed in that period and how much was still to change, urging them to reflect on social norms, to think about where they come from and the effect that they have on people, and to potentially think about how their society still needed to change.